Hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to the first webinar in a series of what we have titled the Global IR Roundtable. My name is Andy Moore, and I'm a current independent IR resident at George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C. My co-moderator, Tarig Elhakim, is currently finishing his internal medicine residency at Kendall Regional Medical Center and will be pursuing IR training to follow. We're both pretty interested in global health IR and are excited to get to moderate this evening's discussion as members of the SIR RFS International Outreach Committee. With regard to the International Outreach Committee of the RFS, in accordance with our mission to provide guidance and resources for students, residents, and fellows interested in international IR service work, we've invited an international group of interventional radiologists to discuss this evening's topic, which is the importance of a global IR equipment procurement network, challenges and opportunities. Just a few quick housekeeping details before we get started. The webinar will be recorded tonight and uploaded to the RFS website and YouTube account for future viewing and reference. The format of tonight's discussion is an informal roundtable conversation between ourselves and our panelists. We hope that by providing a space for deeper exploration of topics relevant to global health IR, we can help ourselves and our audience to grow in our understanding of the current challenges and possible solutions relevant to the field today. Logistically, after about 45 minutes between the panelists speaking, we'll open the floor for any audience questions and comments. Please note that you won't be able to ask your question verbally on this webinar platform, but you can type your questions into the question box in the webinar system, and you can do that as the webinar's going on, as the discussion's happening, and then we can kind of take all of those at the end and present them to our panelists for discussion. So as you think of those questions during the conversation, please type them in. Tarig and I will provide our email addresses in the chat bar for anyone's reference should you have any follow-up questions or communications. Before we get started, we want to thank Jacob Fleming and Scott Biddle, the current RFS Communications co-chairs, as well as Monica Matsumoto and Aya Mugaid, the current RFS International Outreach co-chairs, for helping facilitate this evening's webinar. And finally, of course, we want to thank our panelists for agreeing to share their experiences and insights and for taking the time to participate in today's conversation. So I'll hand it over to you, Tarig, to start us off by introducing our panelists.
Thanks, Andy, for this great introduction. Hello, everyone, and thanks again for participating in this webinar. My name is Tarig Elhakim. I'm originally from Sudan, and I'm currently a PGY3 IM resident at Kendall Regional Medical Center in Miami, and I'll be pursuing IR training afterwards. It is my pleasure actually to have all our guest speakers participating in this webinar, and we would like to send our endless appreciation for joining us here today. First, I would like to start by introducing all our guest speakers by starting here over on top. So the first in our list is Dr. Stephen Hunt, who is an interventional radiologist and assistant professor of radiology at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Hunt is currently the co-director of Penn Image Guided Interventions Laboratory, also known as the PE Lab. The next in our list is Dr. Fabian Laage-Gaupp, who is an interventional radiologist and assistant professor of radiology at the Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Laage-Gaupp is also the co-founder of the Road to IR training program, which actually has been an inspiring innovation that was built to introduce interventional radiology to East Africa. Road to IR has recently graduated the first 3 fellows on his 2-year program at Muhimbili National Hospital in Tanzania. Moreover, we also have Dr. Ian Wilson, who is an interventional radiologist currently practicing at Winsong Radiology in New York. Dr. Wilson was previously a faculty member at the University of Rochester, and he's currently one of the faculty members at the Road to IR training program. He's also the founder of a mural project called the Wall Therapy, which is an internationally renowned mural art project based on Rochester. Moreover, we also have Dr. Janice Newsome, who has excused actually from the initial part of the webinar due to an important meeting, and hopefully she will join us later on. Yeah, Dr. Newsome is actually an interventional radiologist and associate professor in the Department of Radiology and Imaging Service at Emory University School of Medicine. Dr. Newsome is currently the Division Director and Chief of Interventional Radiology and Image-Guided Medicine at Emory University Hospital. She also serves as the Program Director of the Road to IR training program. Moreover, we have Dr. Eric, who actually wasn't able to join today. He's actually an interventional radiologist currently practicing in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. He's a recent graduate from the Road to IR program among the first fellow graduates from the Road to IR training program at Muhimbili National Hospital. So again, I would like to thank all of you for joining us here today. And before I start, I actually want to mention that the idea of this webinar was actually brought up during our RFS International Outreach Committee meetings, where we have some great multiple discussions about internationally IR-related subjects. And one of the trending subjects that we had was the bare availability of disposable interventional radiology equipment in low resource settings. We discovered that there is no systematic supply chain to those regions, but rather it heavily depends on volunteer groups coming from outside those regions. And this is a major issue that is limiting the establishment of IR departments and training programs on these regions and has a negative impact on patients' outcomes. So we were actually carrying, when I went to as part of the Road to IR, I was carrying donated IR equipment on my way to Tanzania, and the experience had actually alerted me about the urgency for establishing an equipment procurement network or a supply chain that can potentially resolve this issue. So with that, I would like to start by letting Dr. Andrew Moore to give the first question to our guest speakers.
Yeah, thanks, Tarig. So Dr. Hunt, if you don't mind, we were going to start with you. I think it would be great if you could just share a little bit about your own experiences working in the global health IR space, just to kind of contextualize your perspectives. And then sort of in light of that, our first question we wanted to talk about with everyone is just, sort of what has been your personal experience specific to the topic of equipment procurement in a resource limited setting.
Sure, you guys can hear me okay, I hope. So, you know, I've been to a number of different countries, and every country has obviously its own challenges and access to equipment. So one of my earliest places I went was Nepal. And the advantage that they have, of course, is its proximity to a lot of the manufacturing hubs in nearby countries like China and India. And so much of the supplies that we got were we were able to get from the neighboring countries, and usually by having co-sponsors coming in from those countries, and obviously we brought some of our own. But they did have in some regional hospitals a limited supply chain set up for these things, and so it was much more a matter of teaching them best practices in doing the actual procedures, as well as how do you keep track of supplies and how do you create accountability for ordering and all of those kind of things that go into that. But definitely saw some unique things there in Vietnam, and then the various places that I've been on the continent of Africa with regards to, you know, just some supplies are just so expensive that they have found the need to find sterilization procedures and reuse. So, for example, at the cancer hospital in Kathmandu, everyone essentially had their own microcatheter if they came in, for example, for HCC treatment. And then they would, if they were wealthy enough, they would own a catheter that would then get sterilized after every time they were treated. Or if they're not wealthy enough, they had one shared microcatheter that everybody used. Then it would get sterilized in between procedures. So that was an example of something that obviously was by necessity and somewhat thinking outside the box from the teams there, but definitely equipment use and reuse is you know, kind of everywhere else in the world. I also think that the culture around the world in terms of disposables is just not at the same level. They're used to a lot of old school equipment, like even hypodermic needles and things like that that get sterilized because they don't have that supply chain for disposables. And and that may be a better practice in many ways if we went into some of the ethics of these things. But that's just kind of my initial statement on that topic.
Awesome. Thank you very much. That was a very helpful insight about what's happening. I actually want to ask the same question to Dr. Fabian. What has been also your personal experience with equipment procurement in this resource limiting setting, especially under your experience with Road to IR and when starting the program?
Thank you. So first of all, thank you guys for organizing this. I think this is a very important discussion. I mean, we all know that to do IR, you need disposable equipment. There's just no way around it. And as you said, I mean, I've been dealing with this now for a few years. I mean, my experience is a lot more limited, just because I can essentially only speak about Tanzania and soon maybe a little bit more about Rwanda. But I assume that the experience in Tanzania is probably somewhat similar in many other countries that are in similar settings. So my experience has been that it is extremely difficult to procure equipment. We've been fortunate that we've had a lot of people travel to Tanzania for teaching purposes, so they've been able to bring equipment along with them. But obviously that's not a long-term solution. And basically from the start, so since 2017, 2018, I've been trying to really initiate procurement by the hospital in Tanzania. And literally 1 month ago, we received the first official shipment of product by a major equipment manufacturer directly to the hospital in Tanzania. Okay, so this was a process that took several years and was extremely difficult. And like my big conclusions so far are that there's like an incredible amount of like intransparency and a lot of red tape at every level. And that's not just, you know, I'm not just blaming the companies, but also hospitals, also governments. It's really at every level. And like, I don't even really know where to begin, but what I do know is that we need to find a solution and, you know, try to work with everyone, you know, governments, non-governmental organizations, hospitals, physicians, et cetera, to find solutions, because the status quo is just not really acceptable.
Thanks, Dr. Wilson. We'll go to you next. And also, I should have clarified at the beginning, we encourage the panelists to also jump in and respond to each other's questions if you find anything you know, interesting to comment on or want to ask your own follow-up question. But Dr. Wilson, it'd be great just to hear a little bit about your experience in the global health IR space, and then specific to that, if you've seen these other issues similar to how Dr. Hunt and Dr. Laage-Gaupp have, or if you have any other insights into how you've seen equipment procurement in your experience play out.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And so my international interventional radiology experience has been, you know, through Road to IR. And prior to that, I had visited some other countries like Haiti and Bangladesh in more of a diagnostic radiology capacity. So the logistical concerns there were a lot simpler. With the highly device-dependent specialty that we are in, it just makes it several orders of magnitude greater in terms of our need to have equipment at the ready such that we can take care of patients. You know, when I see the fellows in Tanzania at the clinics, which run every day, they see folks who need biopsies or drainages or various other procedures, but it's hard to make that commitment to patient care unless the disposables are ready. No matter what it is, whether it's you know, a simple biopsy case or, you know, a TACE or, you know, a peripheral vascular case, patients often travel from quite far within the country being that Muhimbili National Hospital is the national referral center for the country of Tanzania. There's quite a significant travel requirement for a lot of patients to come to the clinic, even, 5, 6, 8 miles, 8 hours away. And so it's difficult to schedule cases when you don't have disposables. And it's going to take a lot of support from, as Dr. Fabian mentioned, all the stakeholders have to be present in the conversation at the table. So much of the burden is put on the patients. A disproportionate amount of burden is put on the patients, and regardless of the country, in any resource challenged country, the patients are the ones that have to account for most of the care. They pay for most of the care in some way or form. And I think it's going to take more than just shifting that burden to the patient. For any of the things that we do to be sustainable, there have to be stakeholders like the hospitals, like the systems, like the countries, themselves have to see the value in what we are all doing and what we're trying to do. Very few of us, except for Eric, who was invited, are natives of these countries. And so as temporary residents, when we're there, we are bringing a lot of that care with us. But eventually, I think any of us should have an exit strategy, for being present in these countries. But it's going to take a concerted effort and buy-in from the hospitals, from the systems and the governments, for any of the things that we're doing to be sustainable for decades to come.
Awesome. That's some great insight about what's going on. And just a general question, like to the, if anyone wants to answer in regards to that. What do you think is like why there is no any current sustainable or reliable source of IR equipment in this low resource settings? Is there some specific reason that you can direct it toward, or anything that you think is the reason behind this?
Yeah. Someone want to go first? Otherwise, I have some thoughts.
You got it.
Go ahead, Fabian.
All right. So, well, I think quite obviously one of the main factors is money, right? Because currently, money and demand, right? So what it comes down to is that until recently, there just hasn't been demand really for IR products in a lot of these countries because not many people there were practicing IR, right? And I think that's also sort of the perspective that the companies take, and that I have to force myself to understand in some ways, is that for them obviously it has to be profitable in some way. But then I think there's the other component, which is a certain degree of ignorance when it comes down to some companies maybe not fully understanding the potential of some of these countries that we're talking about. Because where you have a large population, you will have eventually a lot of IR, and where you have a lot of IR, you will have a lot of demand for equipment. So what I personally think needs to happen is that some of these companies take a little bit of a leap of faith and try to sort of make an investment that will most certainly pay off in the long term. So that's my take on what some of the big underlying issues are.
Dr. Hunt, you want to field that one next?
Sure. I'm wondering, I have some pictorials that might be helpful if I could share my screen at all. Let me see if you're able to do that. But there's published data out there, not just from interventional radiology, which is obviously a younger field as fields are in medicine, but that look at barriers to equipment access, in particular in these regions. And obviously cost being, the number one thing. Can you guys see my screen right now?
Yes.
So this is just an example of looking at spine surgery navigation. Obviously, cost of equipment, 95% of people would respond as a major problem within those sites. But you also have the lack of the trained staff to service the equipment, right? So serviceability. Most vendors aren't interested in selling a product that, and most people are not interested in buying a product that has no ability to be serviced, whether there isn't trained operators to service within country. You have then, of course, the lack of the trained staff to run the equipment. So in other words, the techs, the technologists that would be kind of servicing it and things like that, and experience of operators and things like that. But if you kind of look in the academic literature there, there's literally, you have to go down what are these various factors split out to. So you have obviously medical device cost, and that includes both your expenses that are associated with the device deployment as well as the training of personnel, right? The Road to IR folks have accomplished with all of that effort in terms of training. Most places don't have that level of intervention to actually bring people up to speed on training and that stuff. You have, of course, specialist expertise, even in evaluating at a country level. There aren't specialists in country to tell the country people who might have control of the purse strings what it is, how to evaluate these things, even at that level. And so you would need to then create some kind of national program where you would have experts such as interventional radiologists internationally advising the country on, this is what the essential equipment would be. You have, of course, regulations. If you talk to Boston Scientific or Merit, any of these countries, they say, well, we don't have approvals within those countries. And sometimes a regulatory framework is not even in place to allow for their device use within a country. And so there's many barriers there. You can see even from a company showing up that is willing to sell within country, there's all these barriers already in place. And then, of course, just health needs assessment. Why? What are you doing it for? What is the purpose of bringing that particular, equipment or supply to the country? So what are the population health priorities, things like that? And then, obviously, when would you use this? What are the clinical guidelines for use? So that's just kind of going through that list of what are the various factors and device there. I'm gonna, you can take back the control of the screen there, but I just wanted to run through some of that, because if you go through those sorts of considerations, it's not a single stakeholder that's standing in the way or that's really providing a problem. It's the fact that we take for granted the infrastructure that exists in many places, and more or less in different countries as well. In some countries, there's more of a regulatory framework. For example, in some countries I've been in, they just say anything that has a CE mark or FDA approval is by secondarily extension is approved. So they've just kind of circumvented that. So at least you can bring in supplies and equipment that are FDA or EU approved. But I think that all of those things mean that it's a very ad hoc nature in which you go about getting a specific piece of equipment or a specific device, even something like a drain, which to us is a very simple, uniform piece of equipment or material. Getting that in country can have its barriers. So that's a thought there.
Yeah, Dr. Hunt, I wonder if you could clarify for me, this concept of regulatory approval, I know has come up with like grants that I've helped work on and stuff, and it's never been completely clear to me where that's coming from. Is that from the industry themselves, or in-country approval from their Ministry of Health, or like what factors are at play there, if you know, or if anyone else wants to comment on that?
It is all of those things. And so you do run the risk when you're bringing things through. We've all had that experience at the airport of bringing bags full of medical supplies in, that essentially either you're paying a bribe so they look the other way, which of course has its own societal costs to behaving in that way. Or there just isn't the regulatory framework in place, and so the hospital administrators are not comfortable with it, or perhaps the head of radiology, the HOD, as we always hear, in many places, is like, is this even approved here? If they have a problem with it, and I think operators too, they just don't know, like, is this stuff safe? They're not experienced with it, and so you're bringing them something and you're teaching them a technique, and they're not sure, are we bringing them good stuff, bad stuff? Unfortunately, that has been done. And if you can go look through the medical literature, which is rife with, you know, HIV tests that were brought in that did nothing. You know, they always said negative or whatever, that people were selling them bill of goods. It wasn't good, you know. So I think that there's a lot of distrust there, but it comes down to all of those things. The equipment manufacturers have the same issues, that they want to be selling into a regulatory framework that allows them to have a consistent process for, you know, enabling that supply chain to operate.
Yeah, makes
I think,
sense.
you know, what happens a lot of times, like you mentioned before, about us applying our own, I guess, heuristic to the problems, is that there's a lot of historical things. You know, there's populations there that have been absolutely taken advantage of by, you know, bad actors, you know, from our hemisphere of the planet, you know, and so we can't always fault these countries for being super careful and cautious about what they let into the country. Although it seems that it kind of goes above and beyond, you know, practicality. You know, quite frankly, like you mentioned, things that are FDA approved and that have a CE mark have gone through rigorous testing and so forth. And so there could be some, you know, by extension, you know, granted access, but, you know, we also dealing with, you know, countries that have, again, their own, you know, autonomy, and they want to exert their own control over the population. So as their neighbor, say, neighboring country, you know, may have a certain set of standards, well, that's not theirs. So, and we can't impose that kind of reciprocity, you know, on these countries as well, because we're often their guests. So we have to try to build some consensus, you know, amongst perhaps a group of countries, you know, as we've talked about internally within our group. You know, it would be awesome if there could be some kind of standard that is adopted within sub-Saharan Africa or even the continent. Who knows? Maybe that's wishful thinking, but I don't think it's that far-fetched in terms of the practicality of that, in that the population will have access to these disposables that are in use everywhere else in the world. And so why should the rest of the world benefit and their own countries not? It's my question to the countries.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think, you know, both Ian and Stephen did a great job explaining like how complex the whole topic is and how many different players are sort of involved. But I think what is also the case is that there are huge differences between every single country, right? So, and the fact is that in some countries, these companies have to pay sometimes $10,000, sometimes $100,000 to get a single product approved, and they have to invest a lot of time, a lot of paperwork, a lot of trouble. So obviously they're not really keen on doing that. Now in Tanzania, for instance, you know, we're at the national hospital. We can actually make this whole approval process extremely quick. Okay, we literally do it every other week, because every other week when someone brings in equipment, we actually get approval from the Tanzanian FDA in written format. Okay, so we can, if we and as we have done now, get a procurement shipped directly from a company, we get that approval through the national hospital, through the FDA directly. So this is not an issue. Yet some companies are not willing or not considering selling any product in Tanzania, even though we told them, you know, the regulatory aspect is basically taken care of. And why that is, I don't know exactly. Maybe they're sort of, you know, scarred from experiences in other countries. You know, I can only speculate, or they maybe just don't consider it a worthwhile market. But what I'm saying is that, you know, the issue is that it's very different in each country, which makes the whole thing even more complex. Hi, Janice.
Hello, Dr. Newsome. Thank you for joining us in the webinar. We can hear you actually. Not sure.
No,
Try with Try with your mic, yeah, if you can make it work. All right, so I'll actually move on to the next question, which is how do you think like the COVID pandemic has changed the landscape of this topic today? Have you noticed any changes or any differences from how it was before the COVID era and now?
Hello, hello. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm sorry I'm joining late, but maybe I could take that question. I think that what the COVID pandemic has done is that it has allowed everyone to realize how small our world really is. And your question is, has it changed the landscape for equipment procurement and medical device companies, and how they feel about sending their devices around the countries to other countries? We saw when the pandemic was at its absolute worst, where ordinary citizens were mobilizing and sending ventilators and all types of protective wear to all places around the world. And I think that what that lesson had done to not only to us individuals who are interested in this global health space, but also to bigger manufacturers, is that if they don't get on the bandwagon of trying to figure out how to get their equipment to other places around the world that may need it, then ordinary citizens are going to really start doing it. So, I think the short answer to it is to say I'm optimistic that the pandemic has brought our world a little bit closer. And yes, we're not talking about these heavy big C-arms or IR suites, but that how we can together, you, me, smaller groups are moving to bring equipment to places in the world where they need it. I think the pandemic has shown us that that we don't have to depend on governments or even at times some of these other bigger companies to do it. And if they don't help us to do it, that they might as well just get out of the way, because eventually it's going to get done.
That was a perfect explanation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think
thanks,
it has
Dr.
been.
Newsome.
It's been a bit of a double-edged sword, because by exposing the fragility of current supply chains, as Dr. Newsome pointed out, many of these countries are now focusing on ways to make that not as fragile, which means allowing for redundancy to be built into the system, and instead of it all being controlled through small choke points, kind of the dry ports as they are in Pakistan or whatever, that they allow things to have a bit of a leakier border in that way. And so, in particular, when it came to masks and gloves, I'm thinking of the country Nigeria that I do a lot of work in. Things were controlled in somewhat of a central way before, and then they basically said, okay, any way you can get them here, we'll get them. And so I think that that's an example, as you said, of opening up the borders a bit more and allowing for redundancy to be built into the supply chain that allows them for more of any kind of medical supply and equipment to get through.
I think on the supply side of this equation, from the company side, frankly, and this may sound cynical, but COVID has given some folks, an excuse, to not take action. Like, oh, COVID, we don't have this. Oh, COVID, supply chain, COVID. It's given some folks an out, that exposes, the motivations, for various groups. Unfortunately, that's the what we're dealing with is human nature, right? When you want to find a way, if you want to do something, you'll find a way. If not, you'll find an excuse. And for a lot of folks, again, it's maybe the cynical viewpoint to take. COVID has been a great excuse that was welcomed by a lot of folks who maybe didn't want to take some actions that they maybe would have considered otherwise.
Yeah, very true. I'll I appreciate both Janice's very positive take and then Ian's very negative take, I guess. And
maybe
both,
Ian's realistic take, you know,
yeah.
it is it's
just
the
a
optimism and the
pragmatist.
realism.
Yeah, and I mean you're both right. And the truth is that I actually am probably a little bit disappointed because I remember at the beginning of COVID, I really felt like people were coming together, governments were coming together, continents were coming together. I know that there was talk in Africa specifically about creating a transparent, open marketplace for medical products that was meant to basically completely eradicate all of these national hurdles and to really allow for more transparent and easier, quicker shipping of all medical products, okay, not just ventilators. And what happened to that? Nothing. Okay, it's like absolutely nothing. So I personally think that we could have made more progress in these difficult times. But you know, hopefully Janice ends up being right in the long term.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to being right, because I think that it is true that you know, you're absolutely right, Ian, and you're absolutely right, you know, Fabian. But most good companies want to do good things, and I've said this to a few. Great companies do great things, and the more that you have it, that we are giving companies the opportunities to do great things. And I think so many times, Andrew, we think of the name of the companies as, you know, just that name, but there are individuals there as well, right? And it is making sure that they understand our plight, because really it's a win-win situation, Dr. Hunt, for every company to want to invest in Africa. It is a win-win situation for companies to say, hey, you know, here's a market of people that are trained, that are knowing how to use our devices. But we know that there are complexities that I'm sure you guys have discussed already, that is not easy to figure out. Like, how do we deal with governments? Like, we're not dealing with, you know, Emory University or, you know, this contract. It's a big thing. But I'm hoping that organizations such as, you know, PAIRS and Cersei and Sapphire, and that we're making it easier for good companies to do good things, number one, by having them understand what the need is, and then creating pathways for them to get to that need. Because it's easy, as you know, Fabian, for them to just say, you know, this is too hard. You know, I can't get anybody to answer there. You know, I don't find partners there that understand what I want to talk about. They order these things, and you know what, that's what they order. We're just going to send there. You know, we know that they don't understand, but we're just going to send that there. But if we are never lose hope, never lose heart, and that we're good collaborators, that we know that there's a huge market that's out there, and it's going to be a win-win for the population that needs it and the companies that need to sell it there.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That's a lot of great points to unpack there. Specific to organizations, be they companies or nonprofits or like the WHO, I think there's obviously it's a complex web of how all those things work together. I wondered if we could speak a little bit more about industry partners and companies specifically. It's kind of a nebulous concept for me, at least, and probably for a lot of people, about specifics of how maybe companies can engage in these markets better, and what specifically, if you were going to enumerate for these companies, you would have them take as kind of steps A, B, and C to get things rolling. I wondered if anyone could maybe highlight some of those, of what you've seen in your experience, of ways that we need, you know, specific companies to start making things more accessible and to start building these supply chains.
I have one example just I'd like to talk about from, this is actually has to do with esophageal stents in East Africa. So I could again show a slide if you want to share, let me share the screen, but the esophageal cancer along the eastern coast there it's one of the highest rates in the world. And the surgeons there had kind of identified that, you know, a lot of people show up essentially with obstructive problems. Can you see this slide here? So you can see this is a very recent publication. Are you looking at my slide here, the framework we looked at?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what they said was, look, this is the issue. We want this one product, the self-expanding metal stents for the esophagus and people with, you know, esophageal cancer. And you can see kind of the dark blue areas where the very, very high rates of esophageal cancer. It includes, in fact, Dar es Salaam. So they said, well, we do have some hospitals, such as Mullumbini, that do have endoscopists. In fact, that they do over, I think, 5,000 endoscopies a year there. So it's the highest volume center is there in Tanzania. But they got a group of these companies together and they said, this is what we want to do. So the first thing they did was they had a big project to identify the barriers to access for these esophageal stents. So they had all these different stakeholders, from the endoscopist to the oncologist, all these things. And then, you know, they basically said, okay, here's the barriers, and the hospital level, patient level, and they go through these various things. Then they do, well, what can we guess as a market demand? And this is really what companies look for. You know, you say, I want to put in biliary drains, and they say, well, how many? You know, and what's going to be your volume? So you really need to be showing up with an idea at least. And they said, well, we know from these 4 countries that the demand is at least for 3,000 of these things a year, these esophageal stents. So then they went about going to all the different industry partners who makes esophageal stents. Now they're working with the Clinton Initiative, so they had access probably to resources that, you know, many do not have. But essentially they went to Boston Scientific and they said, look, we know these things are expensive, but we know that your manufacturing cost is a lot lower than what you sell them for. Can you provide us on a subsidized basis towards this collaborative to see if you can gain a foothold in this market by having direct thing there? So Boston Scientific was the one who stepped forward and said, we'd be willing to do this. We'd be willing to manufacture them at a subsidize the cost of them. So then they went back to the regulatory framework, because it was this large group of physicians there, these endoscopists there in East Africa, and they formed this collaborative, and they basically said, okay, here we have an industry partner. Now let's make sure that all the regulatory in all of these countries are on the same page. They're all going to let these stents in. That was done. They set up the centralized procurement process for saying, okay, they're going to track each one of those stents, and they're going to track each one of those procedures, so that they're able to watch the outcomes and see that these things are being used as they should be, and that they're not being wasted or sitting on a shelf somewhere. And then they also developed at the same time training to say, okay, here are the high volume centers. We're going to train other endoscopists to expand this market, because the whole hope of bringing medical equipment in from a company's perspective is that you're going to have a market that's going to grow and expand, and therefore they're going to be able to make money from it from a volume perspective. And then finally, like I said, they have this registry where every single one of those stents is registered, and you can actually go online and find this thing. And then they had these principles of accountability, like they actually have the Stent Access Initiative Steering Committee, and they meet once a year and they talk about how do we expand and what other hospitals could we bring into this network now that we think we haven't trained endoscopists. And so you can imagine the same kind of thing for interventional radiology equipment. And I'm done sharing the screen if you want to take it back. But the point being that here what they did and why it was so effective was they focused on this one very specific clinical problem. The problem of, you know, esophageal occlusions in patients with esophageal cancer, which had a high burden of care along the east coast of Africa. And then they used that as the jumping off point. They started with the need, and they used that as the jumping off point for these various levels of the steps as they went forward. And so this is kind of an example of a step work framework. You know, identify your barriers to access to the equipment, then do your analysis of your market demand, find your industry partners, get your regulatory in place, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that that's one way to think about this problem.
Dr. Hunt, I have a question as a follow-up to what you just mentioned. Do you think it would be useful for us to, like, as you've illustrated this endoscopic example, for us to look at what we do in terms of service lines and say, okay, for this service line, we need these 5 or 10 devices, and kind of take a service line approach, you know, to gaining some foothold with these companies, and to use a similar strategy? Did you think a service line approach would be useful?
I mean, in my experience, that's exactly the issue, because there's going to be a lot more sites, for example, that are going to use biopsy, and then the next thing after biopsy is drainage, right? I mean, you can drain through a needle, right? You could save someone's life by sticking a needle in their gallbladder and decompressing the pus, right? So in that sense, all you needed was some ability to visualize the gallbladder and a needle. That was it, right? So you kind of start with really where's the burden of disease? Because that to me is what we're trying to do is solve, not that we have equipment and we want to bring it to Africa. We're trying to solve the fact that there's a lot of people in a place that are suffering from a high burden of disease. And we have tools that allow for minimally invasive and, more just elegant ways of solving that problem, and perhaps even being cost effective in how we do so. Instead of requiring people to be away from their farm for weeks and weeks at a time from an exploratory laparotomy, we put a little tube in and they're back to work the next day, right? I mean, we all know the value that we provide in IR. So what then it's a matter of, like you said, having that service line that we can say, here's a list of essential equipment for these sets of problems that are encountered in the marketplace. I mean, think about the cost of a myomectomy versus, and what that all entails infrastructure-wise versus what could be done, for example, from a catheter. So whatever your problem is, I think it's a matter of coming up with minimal essential equipment, and not, because you can go to SIR guidelines, but let's be real, it's not built for low and middle income countries. It's built for the Western world. And so I think that we need our own, those kind of documents specific to low and middle income countries. And there are those in surgical literature, and we need to develop those in IR.
My problem is that, with IR, it gets incredibly complex very quickly, right? Because we can't just say, we're focusing on one specific product. Even if we're focusing on like the minimal necessary equipments, we're talking about like between 30 and 50 different pieces of equipment. On top of that, then every company has slightly different names or different versions of all of these. So I see the problem, on the hospital procurement and government approval side, in that nobody who's not an interventional radiologist or a technologist is going to be able to comprehend that, which makes it extremely, extremely difficult to sort of get people on board with these things. Because if we could just, telling them like, okay, we need this one specific product, people may get excited about it and actually do it. But if you tell them you need these 50 products, but then of each of these 50 products, there's like 5 to 10 different versions, it gets a little messy.
Yeah, but I think you can talk about classes of product, just like you talk about, in this case, the esophageal stent case was a very simplified, and that's why you could see the amount of work that was put into just bringing one product to market. And that is why part of what makes our field so difficult. But if you just said, for example, drainage tubes, and they come in various sizes, and it doesn't really matter as long as the vendor is an approved vendor, and you have these approved vendors that have CE or FDA mark. That's how you go about it from a regulatory framework, is to talk about classes of products, sort of like our 510K process, but you have classes of product, and then they fit within approved vendors. And so I think that's all kind of on the regulatory side. In terms of how you bring a company to market, is you have to have the volume there or the potential for market growth. And so that's where I think that you go to a vendor and you say, look, we do X number of drainage procedures across this 5-country area along the east coast of Africa. We're draining abscesses and helping the surgeons, at this volume rate. And then once you have that, you're able to say, this is what it looks like it could grow. We're training people every year, X number of people. They're going to be opening up in these new hospitals. We want to bring these new hospitals online. If you'd be willing to be the provider, the sourcer of these drainage tubes, there's a market there, and we're going to grow it. And so I think that's an example there. Again, it's not focusing on all the various things, because needles and these things, most of them are considered essential enough supplies that they fall under the radar of what is required for their regulatory framework anyway.
Well, I look forward to a day when none of this is going to need to, that we won't need that, because let's talk about it. Why do we have to ship a tube that has some holes in it halfway across the world to a place that has tubes that they can make holes in it? 100%. So this is not something that I believe that we need to stop these shipping pathways. We need our companies to set up their shops right there in the place where we're not looking at, you know, the same type of shipping, issues. And for crying out loud, sometimes a lot of the equipment is damaged just during the transport process. I'm looking forward to, you know, MUHAS and other universities like that partnering with engineering schools there, biomedical engineering schools, where they'll be manufacturing needles. What I mean, like, are you kidding me? A piece of metal with that is sharp at the end, a tube that have a few holes in it. Yes, here in the U.S. we still have to get our C-arms from Germany, and when my machine goes down, I'm waiting for a part that has to come from, you know, wherever. But I want you to know that in Jamaica, where I was born, someone would have gotten that part off a car and retrofitted it to fit the CR, right? So we need that innovation, that initial spirit that sparked our society in our field at the beginning, for that same spirit to be given, so that we're teaching how to fish in every way, teaching how to do these procedures, but also teaching how to manufacture as well.
German engineering is totally overrated.
I agree.
No, but I think it's so true. Like, I mean, what you're saying is, like, at the end of the day, local production is the way to go. And the other thing is, from my understanding, like, a lot of equipment manufacturers, disposable equipment manufacturers in the US and in Europe, their whole business model is built on innovation, right? So they always make products that are even fancier, even nicer, and, you know, we love them, of course, and we use them here, but the whole business model is built on innovation, new patents, and making it, like, incrementally better. But instead, you know, in some countries where the resources aren't the same as they are here, the focus shouldn't be on innovation of, like, incremental improvements, but it should rather be on keeping the costs down. You know, of course, having quality that is, you know, as good as possible. You know, quality has to be good, but there doesn't need to be a new drainage catheter every 2 years. You know, because drainage catheters, the way they are, they work. So I think if local production focused on quality product rather than, like, new products all the time, that's the way to go.
Yeah, quality and cost, Fabian, because I promise you that, you know, whatever it costs to make that part, you know, in the US or in Germany, it's going to be cheaper in Jamaica, in Tanzania, in Rwanda, right? So if it must be innovation with cost, and whatever it costs, Dr. Han, to make a brand new of this in this country. And that's where we really need to focus. And we can say that you can manufacture it at this cost. If we're doing a research study and we're saying that you can run this at this cost, and you get all of your data points, by the time this comes to the US, we know that things that we make in the West, we can't sell them to the developing countries. But if we can manufacture it in the developing countries, we can sell them anywhere for a seismic change. So I think that we need to be helping our companies to shift the way that they think about where production occurs and where does innovation occur. Because if you can innovate in a cheaper way, you're going to be able to sell it everywhere.
You know, it sounds like the key to sustainability, you know, of everything is a business case, right? I mean, we're talking about, you know, so many things that get started, you know, on the philanthropic side, but sustainability long-term is going to come about from a sound business model. And I think part of the challenge with developing a business model in sub-Saharan Africa or in the continent in general is the economics. I think we have to, you know, be mindful of the fact that, you know, everything we're talking about is going to take money. And who's going to be, you know, the initial investor? Who's going to, you know, be that corporate champion that says, you know what, I'm looking at 20 years down the line, you know, of this market being a mature market. It's emerging now. It's going to be mature in about 10, 20 years. And I want to have first mover advantage, you know, in this part of Africa. those are the folks, who will put that initial capital into developing that kind of capacity on the continent. But I think, aside from, or not aside from, but simultaneous to the clinical conversation, we need to have economic conversations, financial conversations, that really, there has to be an exchange of resources, right, to sustain anything. But who's going to pay for that? Who's going to, make that initial investment? Making a sound business case, for this entire enterprise on the continent, I think is going to be the key to finding those partners on the corporate and financial side that can actually power the very things that we all want to have done.
That's awesome. These are very enlightening ideas and thoughts. Thank you all for that. So just a very last question, and then we can wrap this up. We've spoken about the importance of the IR equipment procurement network and how this is something that is very important. What do you guys think about the best strategy to establish a network like this? Who needs to be involved? Who's the what is like a great strategy that you can think out of your head to establish the equipment procurement network?
Well, I mean, I think that, again, it comes back to each piece of that chain. First, you have, as we've been doing, providing a list of essential equipment and supplies for a given procedure. Usually that falls under an indication. And then you're compiling some list of vetted vendors. It doesn't have to mean that they have FDA or CE approval, but in some way they've been vetted by people who have tried the equipment and know that it's, it has some kind of quality to it. And then where you can, finding those pathways of local sourcing and manufacturing if possible, and if not, how are we going to set up some kind of sustainable supply chain? And I think that's where all of this comes down to is the cart and the horse of the market and the supply. We have to show a vendor that there is going to be a market, or that the market is going to expand in some way by demonstrating that there is a market demand. So that takes a lot of homework on the front end of showing that, and showing that vision of the path forward. And then maybe the best practices for use of that equipment and stuff, and so they feel like it's not just going to fall into disuse or get a bad reputation within those countries and kind of poison the well. So I think that all of those things are things that sort of you can work on simultaneously, and you can work on the front end, but that's to me how you're going to go about creating the most sustainable way of getting this kind of thing off the ground.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also what I would say is, there's like the two different components. So there's, the, donated equipment component, just to sort of, get an IR service off the ground, which is obviously just a temporary solution. So that really happens more, I guess, sort of on the, just networking level. And we've been doing a lot of that, but that's not how you're going to run an IR service for decades to come. So a few years ago, I probably would have answered like, where's the solution? I would have hoped it's like the WHO or like one of those larger organizations, because I thought that's kind of what they do. But what I've come to realize over the past few years is that the larger the organization, the slower they are. And there's often not that much they can do. So I tend to agree with Ian, is that probably the solutions are actually going to come from a business standpoint. So eventually there will be companies popping up in Africa, in other continents, in other resource limited settings, where people just get together and try to find a business-minded solution to this problem, because we all know that the need is there. So eventually there will be people that find a solution, whether it's by importing stuff from Europe, from Asia, or whether it's by hopefully producing locally.
I think each of us, who has an interest, vested interest in seeing IR propagate, in resource challenge settings, needs to be, at the table when those conversations are happening. Who better to guide the architects of business modeling than us who are practitioners, of the art, which is going to be modeled. And so I think, we have a lot of value to play. We definitely should not underestimate the value that we can bring to others who may have expertise in the economic and financial world. But we need to be front and center at the table when these discussions are happening. Otherwise, things will get out of control, and things that we know happen on this hemisphere could metastasize elsewhere.
And lastly, I'd say that there are always philanthropy. There are many organizations and companies that are looking to give away $500,000 or more. And if you're hearing this podcast, and I hope you are, I would say that we would gladly help to use your funds for good use. And so, I think that it requires some ingenuity, because there are things that I see, folks that are trying to give their monies away, that they're looking for good causes to give their monies to. So we need every hands on deck, right? So that business case needs to be made. We need the donated equipment so that we can train on it, because we don't want the first time someone is seeing this is the time that they're actually using it. We need some, grants, educational grants. We need free money. We need to make, whatever it is, we need all avenues in order to make a road and to make a sustainable process, so that we can bring, equipment to provide this work or to do this work.
That's awesome. Those are some really great parting words from everybody on this topic. And as with any conversation, it's something that we'll continue to talk about and have moving forward. But I think this was a really great session, I know for us at least. So I think that's a good place to end it. Really appreciate you guys taking the time to join us, and thank you to our audience members for joining in. And like we said, this will be recorded and up for posterity as well for all future donors that definitely want to listen to it in the future. So yeah, on behalf of myself and Tarig, just wanted to mention his camera's not working, but that's the voice coming in from off stage as well, the co-host. So he looks really good. Just take my word for it. So, and also thanks to the RFS for helping us organize and set this up. And yeah, we look forward to the next one. Thank you guys, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a pleasure.